The courtroom was heavy with silence, the tension so thick it seemed to suffocate the room. Jasmine Williams, a 30-year-old black judge, sat at the bench with unwavering composure. Her gaze focused on Ethan Carter, a 40-year-old white police officer with a reputation for bending the law. Today, he was here to testify in a case that had already made waves in the media, but his defiance was palpable. His posture was rigid, his eyes cold, and a smug smirk played on his lips as he stared down at Jasmine, clearly unconcerned by her authority. Jasmine could feel the challenge in the air, the silent assertion that he was above reproach, that no one could touch him, least of all a young woman of color sitting in judgment over him. The room waited, holding its breath, as Jasmine's calm voice cut through the tension. "Officer Carter, please take your seat." But Ethan remained still, his gaze locked on her with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "I don't take orders from people like you," he retorted, his voice dripping with arrogance. The people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, sensing the brewing storm. Jasmine, however, was unshaken. She had seen this before. Men like him, who believed they were untouchable. Men who had spent their entire lives manipulating the system and getting away with it. But today, in her courtroom, that wouldn't be the case. Her voice was steady, but commanding. "This is a court of law," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "You will sit down, or you will be removed." Ethan's smirk widened. "I'd love to see you try," he sneered. And in that moment, the battle lines were drawn. Jasmine Williams grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, where the streets were often filled with more struggle than opportunity. She had witnessed the harsh realities of life for people of color, especially in a system that seemed designed to break them down. Her father, a hardworking mechanic, was wrongfully accused of theft when she was just 12 years old. Jasmine remembered sitting in that courtroom, her small hands clenched into fists as she watched her father, an innocent man, being treated like a criminal. The public defender who was supposed to defend him barely spoke, and Jasmine's frustration grew as she realized how easily the system could fail someone like her father. That day, Jasmine made a promise to herself that she would never be powerless again. She would fight back. Her journey to becoming a judge was not an easy one. As a young woman of color, Jasmine faced obstacles at every turn. Law school was brutal, and the expectations placed on her were twice as high as those on her peers. While others coasted through on connections, Jasmine had to work twice as hard to prove her worth. She was constantly doubted, judged not only for her skills, but also for her race and her age. Despite these challenges, Jasmine excelled. She graduated at the top of her class, passed the bar exam with distinction, and quickly made a name for herself as a tenacious, no-nonsense lawyer. She wasn't just fighting to prove herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been ignored, overlooked, or oppressed by a system meant to serve them. Her reputation as a fierce attorney earned her respect and, eventually, an appointment as a judge. But it also made her enemies. Many felt that a young, black woman should not hold such a powerful position, especially one who had been so vocal about reforming a system that protected the privileged few. Jasmine didn't care about the whispers behind her back or the doubters in the halls of the courthouse. She had worked too hard to let anyone dictate her worth, and now that she was a judge, she was determined to hold people accountable. She wasn't interested in playing politics or appeasing those in power. Jasmine's only focus was justice, and she would not back down, no matter the cost. As a judge, Jasmine was often reminded of how fragile the law could be, and how easily it could be bent or ignored by those who believed they were above it. This realization made her even more determined to uphold the law, no matter how difficult or unpopular it might be. Jasmine had seen firsthand the damage caused by a system that favored the powerful, and she would spend the rest of her life working to ensure that justice was truly for everyone, not just the privileged few. The more cases she handled, the clearer it became that the system needed to change, and Jasmine was willing to be the one to make that change. Ethan Carter had spent the last 15 years of his life patrolling the streets of New York, rising through the ranks of the NYPD with a quiet sense of superiority. His confidence was built not just on his experience, but on a deep-seated belief that he was untouchable. He had grown up in a world where power was synonymous with respect, and his father, also a police officer, had ingrained in him from a young age that the law was something to be manipulated when necessary. To Ethan, The badge wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a shield that protected him from consequences, a tool to wield as he saw fit. Throughout his career, Ethan had used his position to control situations, often bending the rules and using intimidation to get results. He had received dozens of complaints over the years, accusations of excessive force, racial profiling, and harassment, but none of them had stuck. The system had always protected him. Whether through politics, his father's connections, or the weight of his badge, Ethan had learned to navigate the system in a way that kept him insulated from the repercussions of his actions. He believed the law was meant to serve him, not the other way around. In his mind, Jasmine Williams was a mere obstacle, a young, black woman who had somehow managed to rise to power within a system he thought he had mastered. To him, it was an insult. He had heard the whispers about her, how she had made a name for herself by being ruthless in the courtroom, how she had fought to bring justice to those who were often overlooked. He saw her as a threat, not because of her legal mind, but because of everything she represented. A woman like her, holding a position of power, was a challenge to the system that had long favored men like him. When Ethan walked into the courtroom that day, his arrogance was palpable. He could feel the eyes on him, the respect from some, the whispers of doubt from others. He knew that he was a man above reproach. As he approached the witness stand, he noticed Jasmine sitting at the bench, her gaze unwavering. She was young, yes, but he could already tell that she wasn't going to be like the other judges he had faced in his career. He had no intention of being intimidated, though. He would show her who was really in charge. Ethan sat down, his posture casual but defiantly so. He wanted her to know that he wasn't going to play by her rules. When she began to question him, he quickly realized that Jasmine wasn't going to back down. She was methodical, precise, and relentless in her line of questioning, exposing cracks in his testimony. His arrogance began to fade, replaced by irritation. But he wasn't going to let a woman like her, especially one of her background, make him look foolish. The moment the questioning turned tense, Ethan's smirk widened. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with venom. "You know, Judge, it's funny. People like you always think you're in control in here, but the second we step outside these walls, it's a whole different story." The veiled threat hung in the air, and for a moment, Jasmine could feel the weight of it. But she didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her eyes steady, and her voice calm as ever. "Officer Carter, you will watch your tone in my courtroom." In that instant, Jasmine knew she had his number. The tension in the courtroom escalated with each passing moment as Ethan's defiance began to overshadow the proceedings. Jasmine, though calm on the surface, could feel the rising storm. Her experience as a judge had prepared her for this kind of confrontation. She had dealt with difficult defendants before, but Ethan was different. His arrogance wasn't just a personal flaw. It was a symbol of a broken system. A system that had allowed men like him to act with impunity for far too long. But this time, Jasmine wasn't backing down. As the questioning grew more intense, Jasmine's mind sharpened with each answer Ethan gave. His story was full of contradictions, and she, with the precision of a skilled surgeon, picked apart every detail. The more she exposed his lies, the more he shifted in his seat, his once cocky smirk starting to falter. He was no longer the untouchable officer. Now, he was a man who was visibly sweating under the scrutiny. The room watched as Jasmine relentlessly pursued the truth, her calm demeanor standing in stark contrast to the storm that raged in Ethan's mind. He could feel the walls closing in, and with every question, his control over the situation slipped further away. But then, in a moment of desperation, something shifted in Ethan. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a look that sent a chill down Jasmine's spine. His voice dropped, becoming low and dangerous. "You know, Judge, it's funny," he began, his tone dripping with venom. "People like you always think they're in control in here. But the second you step outside, it's a whole different story." The room fell into a tense silence, the unspoken threat hanging in the air like a cloud ready to burst. It wasn't just a challenge to Jasmine's authority. It was a direct warning, a signal that Ethan believed he could make her crumble under pressure. Jasmine, however, didn't flinch. She had seen men like Ethan before. They relied on fear, intimidation, and arrogance to get what they wanted, but Jasmine wasn't one to be intimidated. Her voice remained steady, unwavering as she responded. "This is a court of law. "Officer Carter," she said, her words sharp and measured. "You will sit down and answer the questions, or you will be removed." There was no room for negotiation in her tone. It wasn't just a statement. It was a command, one that left no room for disobedience. But Ethan wasn't going to give in that easily. With a mocking laugh, he refused to back down. "I'd love to see you try," he sneered, his arrogance still evident in his voice. The room shifted uneasily, knowing that things were about to get much worse. Jasmine could feel the anger bubbling inside of her, but she kept it under control. This was a moment of truth, and she wasn't going to let Ethan or anyone else push her into reacting impulsively. She took a deep breath, her mind focused. She knew exactly what she had to do. Suddenly, without warning, Ethan stood up from the witness stand, his fist cutting through the air with a force that no one could have predicted. The sound of his punch landing on Jasmine's face rang through the courtroom like a gunshot. The room erupted into chaos as gasps filled the air. Papers flew, and some people screamed in horror, while others froze in shock. Jasmine stumbled slightly, her head snapping to the side from the force of the blow, but she did not fall. She refused to give Ethan the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Blood trickled from her lip as she slowly straightened, her face a mask of controlled fury. The room was stunned, unable to fully process what had just happened. Ethan, on the other hand, stood there, his chest heaving as if he had just done something justified. His face was flushed with what he must have thought was triumph. But Jasmine wasn't about to let him have that victory. Slowly, she wiped the blood from her lips and locked eyes with him again. And then, with the force of a storm breaking, Jasmine spoke. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice cold and cutting, "you just assaulted a sitting judge in a court of law." The words hung in the air, the gravity of the situation sinking in for everyone present. Ethan took a step forward, but Jasmine raised her hand to stop him, her eyes never leaving his. "You will be arrested immediately," she said, her voice unwavering. This was no longer just about power or authority. It was about making sure that no one, not even someone like Ethan Carter, could escape the consequences of their actions. The courtroom was silent, the reality of what was happening sinking in. For the first time, Ethan Carter, untouchable, invincible in his mind, looked uncertain. His hands twitched as the officers around him hesitated, unsure of what to do. He still believed that he could escape, that someone would step in to protect him. But as the first set of handcuffs clicked around his wrists, his world shifted. His face twisted in disbelief, his eyes wide as he realized that the rules were about to change, and for him, there was no way out. "You can't do this," he hissed, struggling against the cuffs as he tried to pull free. But the officers held firm, their hands steady as they guided him toward the exit. For the first time in his life, Ethan Carter wasn't in control. For the first time, the system that had always protected him was about to expose him for what he truly was, an abuser of power. And Jasmine, despite the blood on her lip and the pain in her face, stood there unyielding, a force to be reckoned with. As the shock of Ethan Carter's assault on Jasmine Williams reverberated throughout the courtroom, an eerie silence descended. The room was frozen, caught in the moment of disbelief, with eyes wide and breath held. Jasmine, despite the pain that throbbed at her lip and the immediate swelling of her cheek, stood tall. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. It was as if the force of Ethan's punch had only strengthened her resolve. The officer who had once walked through life believing he could do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, was now in handcuffs, about to face the consequences he had always evaded. Ethan, on the other hand, stood there, visibly stunned. His smirk, which had been so confident just moments before, was now replaced by a look of pure disbelief. For the first time in his life, he was being held accountable. His hands twitched at his sides as the reality of his situation slowly began to sink in. He had spent his entire career using his badge as a shield, acting with impunity, and now, in front of a room full of witnesses, he had crossed the line, assaulting a sitting judge in her own courtroom. It was unthinkable, and yet it had happened. The arrogance that had once defined him was now replaced by something else, uncertainty. "Do you know who I am?" Ethan spat out, his voice low and dangerous as he struggled against the officers who had come to arrest him. His words were laced with the same entitlement that had gotten him this far, but Jasmine could see the flicker of panic in his eyes. His usual confidence had evaporated. And now he was a man who knew he was no longer untouchable. Jasmine's gaze was unflinching, her expression one of cold determination. She knew exactly what Ethan had done, and she knew that this was just the beginning. It wasn't just about one man. It was about the system that had allowed men like him to thrive for so long. The system that had protected him from the consequences of his actions. It was time for that to change. Do you think this is some game? Jasmine's voice rang out, her words deliberate, her authority unyielding. You assaulted me in front of everyone. Officers, witnesses, and cameras. Do you really think you can walk away from this? Ethan tried to break free, the anger and desperation rising in his chest. I'm untouchable, he shouted, his voice growing more frantic. You can't do this. The system will protect me. You don't know who you're dealing with. But Jasmine's eyes never wavered. She was resolute. You're not untouchable anymore, Ethan, she said, her voice steady as a rock. And no one is coming to save you this time. The officers hesitated for a moment, but only for a moment. They had seen this before, the way a powerful man like Ethan could manipulate the system to get away with anything. But what Jasmine had just done, standing tall in the face of his violence, had shifted the balance. There was no turning back now. For the first time, they saw the possibility of true justice, of a man who had long been above the law, finally being held accountable. As the officers moved forward to restrain Ethan further, the room watched in tense silence. The weight of the moment was palpable, and it felt as though the entire courtroom was holding its breath. Ethan's struggles became more frantic, his face twisted in disbelief as the handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. The reality of the situation hit him harder than any blow ever could. His sense of invincibility, the arrogance that had carried him through his entire career, shattered in an instant. You can't do this. Ethan screamed one last time, but his voice lacked conviction. It was no longer the voice of a man who believed he could control everything around him. It was the voice of someone who finally understood that the world had shifted beneath his feet. For the first time, he was powerless. Jasmine, despite the blood still staining her lips, stood tall and unwavering. This was more than just about one officer. It was about the future, about a system that had failed to hold the powerful accountable for far too long. And now, that system was being forced to reckon with the consequences of its own actions. Jasmine wasn't just delivering justice in this moment. She was taking back control of a broken system, one that had long allowed men like Ethan to walk free. Take him away, Jasmine ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos in the courtroom. As the officers led Ethan toward the exit, his face still a mask of disbelief, Jasmine turned to face the room. There were no cheers, no applause, only a quiet, overwhelming sense of justice finally being served. In that moment, Jasmine knew that this victory was only the beginning, but it was a victory nonetheless. One that would change the course of the future, and in a small but significant way, shift the power back to the people who had long been denied it. The news of Ethan Carter's arrest rippled through the city like wildfire. What had started as a quiet day in the courthouse turned into a media frenzy, as reporters swarmed the building, desperate to get a statement. The moment Ethan's handcuffed form was led out of the courtroom, cameras flashed and microphones were thrust in his face. But what no one saw, what no one could yet fully understand, was the storm brewing behind closed doors. Jasmine Williams had made her stand, but she was about to find out that standing up for justice came with its own set of consequences. As the days passed, the tension in the courtroom and in the streets only intensified. Ethan's arrest had caused a massive ripple, one that was threatening to undermine the delicate balance of power that had long been in place. The police union immediately began calling for an investigation into Jasmine's conduct, questioning her decisions, her temperament, and whether her actions had been too emotional. Anonymous sources began leaking rumors about her supposed biases, her decisions allegedly driven more by personal vendettas than by the law. Behind the scenes, the whispers of discontent were growing louder, and Jasmine knew the battle she had won in the courtroom was far from over. It wasn't just the police union that was mobilizing against her. Powerful political figures, those who had long enjoyed the privileges of the system, began quietly circling. They couldn't afford to let someone like Jasmine disrupt the fragile system that protected men like Ethan. Jasmine had dealt with the prejudices of her profession before, but now, it felt different. Now, The entire establishment was coming for her. The mayor's office, while publicly standing by the judicial process, had begun to send signals of doubt. Behind closed doors, phone calls were being made, trying to sway the tide in Ethan's favor. Jasmine wasn't naive. She knew the system she had spent her life fighting for could just as easily turn against her. She had expected backlash, but not this kind of force. It was personal now. The very institution she had spent years serving was beginning to test her resolve. They weren't just trying to protect one officer. They were trying to protect the status quo. And if that meant sacrificing her in the process, then so be it. Still, Jasmine stood firm. In the quiet moments between court sessions, in the stillness of her chambers, she would reflect on what this fight truly meant. She wasn't just fighting for her reputation, for her career. She was fighting for every person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or crushed under the weight of a system that valued power over truth. She had made a promise to herself all those years ago. She would never be powerless again. And no matter how much they tried to tear her down, she would not give up on that promise. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Text messages from colleagues, from friends, from strangers flooded her inbox. Some were supportive, others worried. Everyone had an opinion on the situation. But one message stood out. It was short, blunt, and it came from an unknown number. "They're coming for you." Jasmine's heart sank as she read the message. She had known this was coming, but seeing it in black and white made it all the more real. She wasn't just facing a fight for justice. She was facing a fight for her survival. They were going to use every trick in the book to discredit her. The investigations into her conduct had already begun. Internal reviews of every case she had ever ruled on were being conducted, all in an effort to find something, anything, that could be used against her. The police department, desperate to save face, was using every ounce of its influence to shift the narrative. The investigation was no longer about justice for Ethan's actions. It was about dismantling Jasmine's career. But Jasmine wasn't about to let them win. She had faced battles like this before, in different forms. The whispers of doubt, the media's fickle attention, the politics, it was all just noise. She had a job to do, and she wasn't about to be intimidated by those who had spent their lives twisting the system to their advantage. The pressure was mounting, but Jasmine was used to carrying heavy burdens. In the face of everything, she remained calm, her resolve hardening with each passing day. They had underestimated her, thinking that she would crumble under the weight of their scrutiny. But Jasmine Williams wasn't going anywhere. The fight for justice didn't end when the cameras stopped flashing. It was a battle she had already won, and no matter how hard they tried to drag her down, Jasmine would stand firm. As the weeks went by, the pressure on Jasmine Williams only intensified. The political machine that had long protected the status quo began to turn its gears, and Jasmine could feel the weight of it bearing down on her. The police union, furious over Ethan Carter's arrest, continued to amplify their calls for an investigation into Jasmine's conduct. They were relentless in their pursuit, trying to paint her as a judge who had let her emotions cloud her judgment. Every decision she made was now under a microscope, with people eager to find any misstep, no matter how small, that they could use to discredit her. The press, which had initially rallied behind Jasmine as a symbol of justice, began to shift as well. The story of the rogue officer who had assaulted a judge, followed by his dramatic arrest, had initially captivated the nation's attention. But now, the media's focus was slowly transitioning to the controversy surrounding Jasmine's actions. Some outlets framed her as a hero who stood up to the abuse of power, while others questioned whether she had overstepped her authority. The narrative was being rewritten by those who had always benefited from the system. Behind closed doors, the political landscape was shifting. The mayor's office, which had been cautious in its support, began distancing itself from Jasmine. The pressure was mounting from the higher-ups, and they weren't going to let one rogue officer bring down their carefully crafted image. Jasmine was now seen as a liability, and the word recusal was being whispered in the halls of power. The whispers had started to feel more like a command. The system, it seemed, was ready to sacrifice her to preserve its fragile structure. Jasmine wasn't naive. She knew this was coming. She had anticipated the pushback, the legal battles, the media frenzy. What she hadn't expected was the speed at which the attack had come. Within days of Ethan's arrest, she found herself under investigation. Anonymous sources began leaking claims about her supposed bias, accusing her of making decisions based on personal grudges. The legal community, once a source of support, was now turning on her. Colleagues who had once respected her were now questioning her impartiality. Even some of the officers who had stood by her in the courtroom had begun to waver. Still, Jasmine refused to back down. She had spent years fighting against a system that allowed men like Ethan Carter to flourish. She wasn't about to let it take her down now. The weight of the accusations, the scrutiny, and the isolation only fueled her determination. Jasmine knew that she had a duty, not just to herself, but to everyone who had ever been wronged by the justice system. She couldn't let this be the end of her fight. She knew the stakes had gotten higher, but she wasn't willing to let fear or intimidation make her compromise her integrity. As the investigation into her actions continued, Jasmine focused on the bigger picture. She had spent her life trying to fix a broken system, and she wasn't going to let it break her now. She had faced adversity before and come out stronger for it. This time, however, it wasn't just about one case or one officer. It was about a systemic change that was long overdue. As the pressure mounted, Jasmine remained steadfast, never once wavering in her belief that justice would prevail. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she had no intention of backing down. She was determined to show the world that no matter how powerful or entrenched someone might be in the system, they were not beyond the reach of justice. The battles that lay ahead would test her, but Jasmine Williams was ready. She had come too far to let this fight slip away, and the world was watching, waiting to see whether she would emerge victorious. In the face of the mounting opposition, Jasmine understood that this was more than just about one case. It was a battle for the very soul of the justice system. And if she had to fight for that, she would. She wouldn't let the corruption, the power struggles, and the politics define her legacy. The fight for justice wasn't over, and Jasmine was ready to carry that torch forward, no matter what came next. As the investigation into Ethan Carter's past continued, Jasmine Williams was confronted with a shocking revelation, one that would change everything. It wasn't just Ethan's actions in the courtroom that had finally brought him to justice. It was what she uncovered about his past that made his punishment so deeply personal. Jasmine had received a tip from an anonymous source, someone who had been in the department years ago and knew of Ethan's previous misdeeds. The documents that arrived in a plain envelope were damning. As Jasmine carefully sifted through the papers, she stumbled upon a series of police reports from over a decade ago, reports detailing misconduct and shady dealings that Ethan had been involved in. Her eyes narrowed as she read through the entries. Among the names and dates, one stood out to her, a case involving her father. Jasmine's father, the man who had been falsely accused of theft when she was a child, had been a victim of Ethan's actions. The revelation hit Jasmine like a thunderclap. The police officer who had been responsible for her father's wrongful arrest, the officer who had participated in the corruption that ruined their lives, was none other than Ethan Carter. Her stomach churned as she realized that Ethan had been directly involved in a case that had haunted her family for years. The anger that had been simmering inside her now boiled over, but it wasn't just the pain of a child who had lost their father's dignity. It was the rage of a woman who had dedicated her life to justice, only to learn that the very man she had put on trial had been the same one who had wronged her family all those years ago. Jasmine sat back in her chair, the papers trembling slightly in her hands. This wasn't just about one officer now. This wasn't just about her courtroom and the challenge of holding Ethan accountable for the assault. This was about making sure that Ethan Carter didn't escape justice for the crimes he had committed long before he ever laid a hand on her. She had spent so much of her life believing that her father's case was an anomaly, a mistake in the system. But now, with the truth in front of her, she saw the pattern. Ethan had been part of the corruption, part of the system that had turned a blind eye to the suffering of families like hers. This discovery fueled Jasmine's resolve even further. It wasn't just about making a point to the powerful figures who had long protected men like Ethan. It wasn't just about her own quest for justice. It was about taking down the system that had allowed such abuses of power to continue unchecked for so long. Her father's story, her family's pain, and the betrayal they had suffered, it all came rushing back to her. But this time, Jasmine wasn't just a little girl sitting in a courtroom watching her father's life unravel. This time, she was a judge, and she was going to make sure that Ethan Carter was held accountable for everything he had done. With renewed determination, Jasmine knew that the battle was far from over, but she was more prepared than ever to see it through. The truth had a way of resurfacing, no matter how deep it had been buried, and now that she had the evidence she needed, Jasmine was ready to expose it all. Ethan Carter had a long history of escaping the consequences of his actions, but that was about to change. The fight for justice had become deeply personal, and Jasmine was prepared to see it to the end. The trial of Ethan Carter had finally arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Jasmine Williams, still reeling from the discovery of Ethan's involvement in her father's wrongful conviction, now stood at the center of it all. The truth, once buried beneath layers of corruption and injustice, was now exposed for the world to see. The case had taken on a significance that went beyond the charges against Ethan. It had become a symbol of the long-overdue reckoning with a system that had failed so many. For Jasmine, it was more than just a trial. It was an opportunity to confront the ghosts of her past and to make sure that no one, no matter their power or position, could escape the consequences of their actions. Ethan, now seated in the defendant's chair, had lost much of the swagger that had once defined him. The arrogant, untouchable officer was now a man facing the full weight of his wrongdoings. His defiant attitude had been replaced with a tense unease. The once confident smirk that had graced his face was now gone, replaced by a tight jaw and clenched fists. He was no longer the powerful figure he had once been in the courtroom. Jasmine could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that this time, he wasn't going to walk away unscathed. The proceedings unfolded with methodical precision, as Jasmine guided the court through the presentation of evidence. She was relentless, meticulous in her questioning, determined to leave no stone unturned. The documents detailing Ethan's past transgressions, including his involvement in her father's case, were laid bare for the world to see. The room fell silent as the truth settled over everyone like a heavy weight. Ethan's face turned ashen as the damning evidence piled up against him, each piece revealing the true extent of his corruption. No longer could he hide behind his badge or his reputation. His actions, both past and present, were now in the open, and Jasmine would make sure that he was held accountable for every one of them. As the trial continued, Jasmine's resolve only grew stronger. She knew that this moment wasn't just about Ethan. It was about the systemic failures that had allowed men like him to thrive for so long. She was no longer just a judge presiding over a case. She was the embodiment of a force that sought to right the wrongs that had been allowed to fester within the justice system. Her focus never wavered as she stood at the helm, guiding the court through the unraveling of Ethan's defense. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, the room fell into a tense, breathless silence. The foreman stood, his face stoic as he unfolded the paper. "We, the jury, find the defendant Ethan Carter guilty on all counts," he announced, and in that moment, Jasmine felt a rush of relief. It was over. The man who had abused his power for so long, the man who had ruined lives with impunity, had been brought to justice. The courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs as people absorbed the magnitude of the moment. Jasmine, however, remained composed. The fight wasn't over, not yet. The consequences of Ethan's actions had only just begun. His sentencing would come later, but Jasmine knew that this trial was just the beginning of a larger conversation. One about reform, accountability, and the need for a justice system that truly served the people. As Ethan was led away, his face twisted with disbelief, Jasmine took a moment to reflect on everything that had led to this moment. She had faced the darkest corners of the system and come out victorious, but her work wasn't done. This victory was important, yes, but it was just a single step in a much larger battle. Jasmine had made sure that Ethan Carter couldn't escape justice, and in doing so, she had proven that even those who believed themselves untouchable could be brought to their knees. The truth had prevailed, and for Jasmine, that was all that mattered. As Jasmine Williams stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the weight of the moment finally settled over her. The media was in full force, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence around her, the stillness in the air, spoke volumes. This wasn't just a victory in one case. It was a message to the world. The man who had been untouchable, the officer who had used his badge as a shield to protect himself from the consequences of his actions, had finally been brought to justice. Jasmine's heart didn't swell with pride, though. This wasn't about personal triumph. It was about the larger message of accountability that she had fought for. This was a win for all those who had suffered at the hands of the powerful, for all those who had been told their voices didn't matter. Jasmine had faced immense pressure throughout the process. She had been questioned, doubted, and scrutinized from every angle. Yet, she had never wavered. The path she had chosen had not been easy, but it was the one she knew she had to walk. In doing so, she had not only stood up for justice in her courtroom, but had challenged the very system that had allowed men like Ethan Carter to operate with impunity for so long. The fight was far from over. Jasmine knew that. But for today, at least, justice had been served. As she stood there, the cameras and microphones still pointed at her. Jasmine felt the weight of something bigger. She had proven that, no matter how powerful a person was, the law could not be bent to their will. Ethan Carter's fall was a symbol, a victory not just for her, but for everyone who had ever felt voiceless in the face of corruption. The system had been tested, and it had been forced to reckon with its flaws. Jasmine knew the battle for justice would continue. The system was far from perfect, and there were many more battles to fight. But today, she had made a powerful statement. Today, the truth had triumphed. And Jasmine would not stop until the system that allowed Ethan and others like him to thrive was fully held accountable. This was just the beginning.